Hello, everyone. It's Francis Widdowson here. This is the second video in a two-part series that is going to be looking at trans activism and how trans activism negatively affected my ability to be reinstated. It resulted in me being terminated from Mount Royal University, and then now when I'm trying to get reinstated, my case is going before the Alberta Labor Relations Board. It went before the board on February 6th because the arbitrator, David Philip Jones, had said that although I'd been wrongfully terminated, I couldn't be reinstated for a number of reasons, but the most significant in this case is that my relationships with some other colleagues have been negatively impacted. And my response to that is that I was mobbed by at least 40 faculty members for discussing and criticizing what's called woke ideas. And those are the ideas in totalitarian identity politics that the identities of groups that maintain that they are oppressed must be affirmed. And my attempts to draw attention to this problem of affirming these identities in an academic context made a lot of colleagues feel upset. And as a result of that, they wanted to push me out. And if there were any justice in the world, the arbitrator would have seen through what had happened at Mount Royal University and not allowed these bullies to be able to win. But because the whole system reinforces and protects the way the existing system is structured, it's an uphill battle trying to find justice through the legal system. So what I have to do now is I have to hold everyone who is responsible for what happened to account, and that's what I'm going to do. And what happens when I try to do that is that the lawyer for Mount Royal University argues that this is further evidence that I shouldn't be reinstated. But because I think the truth about what is happening in universities is the most significant value that can be pursued, I am going to continue to try to expose what happened at Mount Royal University, because it's not just Mount Royal University that is being corroded by this incredibly harmful ideology. It is all universities in Canada, and this includes all the universities in Alberta. And I'm very, very surprised that the government, after bringing in its free speech directive and talking about how important it is to have free speech in universities, is doing nothing about what has happened. And we need to have a public inquiry about universities as to why they are not functioning the way that they're supposed to be functioning. So to help us understand this latest installment in trans activism, which is the second part of a two-part series, I would like to share my screen with you and show you what had happened with respect to the issue of my lack of reinstatement with respect to the trans activism issue. Okay, so here we have the wokeacademy.info site and the post on that site, which is called The Francis Widdowson Case, and There Are Only Two Sexes. And you'll notice this picture here, which is of two individuals standing in front of a sign saying, "I love trans rights." Those individuals are, on the left, D.A. Dirks, who's a contract faculty member at Mount Royal University, and perhaps more significantly, on the right is Scott Murray, associate professor and chair of the Department of Humanities at Mount Royal University. So Dr. Murray is quite a powerful faculty member at Mount Royal University and is also chair of a very significant department, and also has been actively involved in the Mount Royal Faculty Association, so the union. And I want to discuss the role that Dr. Murray, as well as a number of other professors, have played in my inability to get reinstated at Mount Royal University. So, as I mentioned in this post, this is the second of a two-part series, and the first one concerns my termination, which was the result of progressive discipline and the fact that I was disciplined initially for one tweet about a cartoon that D.A. Dirks had been showing at a how to use pronouns workshop about misgendering fatigue. And this cartoon I thought was absurd, and I satirized that cartoon. And as a result of the satirization, it was found that I had mocked D.A. Dirks' identity, which I had not. I had mocked this idea of misgendering fatigue. And as a result of that, I was found to have violated 3 policies and 2 laws, which I think is absurd, because in order for harassment to have taken place generally, first of all, it has to be repeated in terms of one's belittling of someone or making it impossible for them to do their job. And secondly, it has to be shown to have some kind of impact. And how one tweet on social media about this cartoon could have had such significant impact really was not demonstrated at all. And then we had, so when I was terminated because of progressive discipline and being found to have harassed other people for satirical tweets, then I went through a grueling and abusive, absolutely abusive arbitration process. And in that process, I had to go through 30 hearing days spread over the entire year of 2023. And at the end of all that, the imperious and inept arbitrator, David Philip Jones, decided that I could not be reinstated for 9 reasons. But the most significant ones were, number 3, the reluctance of a number of witnesses who were co-workers to see her return to the workplace, and then the friction between her and other colleagues, as exemplified by the Lindstrom and Watchman complaints, but presumably other sources of friction which concern ideas in the workplace. And which brings me to Mary Lee Mulholland, the chair of the Sociology and Anthropology Department at Mount Royal University, also a very powerful faculty member at Mount Royal University. And talking about these colleagues is seen by MRU to be more evidence that I can't be reinstated. But I'm not talking about anything personally to do with these colleagues. I'm talking about their ideas, which is making it so that they clash with attempts to talk about controversial issues, such as trans activism. And Mary Lee Mulholland testified at the arbitration proceedings. Interestingly, D.A. Dirks and Scott Murray did not. So this is one of the people who testified at the arbitration hearings. And at the arbitration hearings, Mary Lee Mulholland argued that one of the reasons why I should not be reinstated was because I said things like trans people did not exist. And she was cross-examined on this point. And when she was cross-examined, she said that I hadn't said that. She didn't remember me saying that, but I had said that there were only 2 sexes, only the sexes were male and female. And this, in her view, was saying that trans people do not exist. So stating a biological fact, according to Mary Lee Mulholland, means that one's denying the humanity of trans people, and therefore this goes against one's reinstatement. And this is the area of the arbitration proceedings on May 16th, 2023, where that testimony was given. And those are my notes from the arbitration hearing when she was being cross-examined about this matter. And that was not the only claim that Mulholland made. She made a number of allegations about my behavior. And as will be seen in my notes, which I could go through in detail, every single allegation that Mulholland made was refuted. And I tried to provide evidence of this on the website, but the union, because this caused friction with a whole bunch of colleagues at Mount Royal, demanded that I take down the submission, which shows that. So at some point after the arbitration is going through its end point, I'll be able to post those submissions because they are the exhibits in the arbitration process, which are public, but because we're currently going through the appeal, that can't be done at this point in time. So I've talked about a number of people: Dirks, Murray, Mulholland. All of these colleagues are involved with the union, and the union has had serious problems in being able to defend me in this case. And this was evident on September 20th, 2024, when there was a meeting that was held to discuss my case and why I was not being reinstated. Why they were appealing my lack of reinstated. A statement to the Labor Relations Board. I was not allowed to attend that meeting that was discussing my case. I was prevented from being at that meeting. I was told that there was just going to be procedural matters discussed and they weren't going to get into the nuts and bolts of my case. This was not true. And what we had happen was an outrage, an absolute outrage, which I'm still incredibly angry about, because what happened is the union president allowed Professor Mulholland and Scott Murray, the chair of the humanities department, who is also, I should mention, and I know this is a personal item, but it's relevant because it impacts the academic judgment of the person involved, is that D.A. Dirks is the spouse of Scott Murray, which is going to come up in the comments that were made in this meeting. And both Mulholland and Murray stood up and made a case that the union should not be defending me and that I should not be reinstated because of the harm that I had caused. And I was not able to defend myself against these arguments and, in fact, a defamatory comment that was made about me. So I wasn't allowed to attend, but I knew people who did, and I was provided with notes as to what had happened, and these are the notes that I was given. And when Mary Lee Mulholland was speaking, she said that the decision that I was wrongfully terminated was very upsetting, and that it wasn't a victory because of all the people I had harmed, right? Satirical tweets defending myself from people trying to get me fired at Mount Royal University. And the president pointed out that it was the responsibility of the employer to deal with member complaints, and that they were contesting the actions taken against me. And the lawyer explained that, the union has a duty to defend all its members. And Mulholland objected to her dues being used for, appealing my lack of reinstatement. And interestingly, she felt that she had been victimized by the expression Gang of 17, even though it didn't apply to her at all. The 17 were not part of her. Why is she identifying with the Gang of 17? She wasn't included within that. And she said that she was upset that the union had participated in this smear, and reiterated that she was upset that her union dues were being spent in this way. And then we have Scott Murray, the spouse of D.A. Dirks, who was one of the people who filed harassment complaints against me about the misgendering fatigue cartoon. And he said that most people knew that it was personal for him because his spouse was involved, but this was difficult, and to be objective, no kidding. So why is he being able to smear me in front of a crowd of what I heard was about 60 people? So he said he read the decision, classing the decision as a victory for FW. Francis Widdowson was false. In fact, not only was it not a victory, but it was misleading to characterize it as a win, because they had failed to note that the arbitrator ruled against me on 8 of the accounts and found her guilty of harassment. And why was that not being appealed by the union, those findings of harassment, which were absurd? Well, because of the powerful people, the faculty members, who seem to have a lot of control over the union, to the point where they're able to say whatever they want about me. Emails can be sent to the entire membership, and I'm not allowed to have any response to the membership. And then we get to the Gang of 17. He referred to me directly as she, and said that I had intentionally coined the phrase that the knowledge that it derived from the Gang of 4 during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So it was argued that I made up this term, Gang of 17, and that was because I was trying to draw some kind of parallel to the Gang of 4 in the Chinese Revolution. Both Mulholland and Murray suggested that the use of the phrase caused further harm. Harm. That's what I do through my attempts to fight back against a bunch of professors who cannot tolerate different points of view being expressed. And that he said that his partner, D.A. Dirks, had been deeply hurt and harmed by Francis Widdowson, again implying that my firing was justified. This is an absolute outrage. I cannot say how angry I am about how the union allowed this to happen. And then Mulholland and Murray's reference to the Gang of 17. This was false. It was not me who made up this term. So Murray's argument that it was me and because of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, that is bordering on defamation, what he has done, and that was completely facilitated by the union. Fortunately, I had good notes about this, so I went and I looked it up as to where it was, and lo and behold, it was June 12th, 2023, when Michael Ford, the lawyer for MRU, said, I'm going to call this the Gang of 17. So he's the one who's calling it the Gang of 17, and that the complaint that I filed about 17 of my colleagues that was investigated by Steve Eichler. So in terms of Murray's involvement in this situation, as I mentioned, he's the spouse of D.A. Dirks, and he has been, making arguments, trying to delegitimize my attempts to discuss contentious issues for a number of years. And this was evident on May 15th, 2021. So this was about 7 months before I was fired. And there was an event that was held on Zoom where, again, the union's controlling information, people's ability to challenge. So we weren't able to actually appear on Zoom and ask questions. We had to put them in the chat. And I would like you to hear what it is that Murray said in May 2021.
This is the principal reason why I felt it necessary to participate in this panel, because in my view, it's not okay to claim that academic freedom is under threat if it's not.
And he doesn't think academic freedom is under threat at Mount Royal University.
Even if it is being done in an attempt to draw attention to injustices and abuses that demand redress. I contend that academic freedom at MRU is exceedingly well protected. Unlike many universities, we have a very strong academic freedom article that is embedded in our CA, and that article is referred to throughout relevant university policies, which is an extremely important way in which academic freedom is safeguarded.
So because it's in the collective agreement and referred to a number of policies, it's protected exceedingly well. Nonsense. I would never have been terminated if that were the case. But of course, Murray doesn't think that my circumstances relate to academic freedom at all, and we'll see why.
Moreover, MRU, like every other PS institution in Alberta, has had imposed on it by government a requirement that we have a freedom of expression policy. And to that end, MRU has struck a presidential task force on freedom of expression, and I believe Mark sits on that same task force. And while freedom of expression is not emphatically not the same thing as academic freedom, there is considerable overlap between the two. And notwithstanding some exaggerated and at times patently false claims made by some
exaggerated and patently false claims, he never specifies how this is the case unless it's in a secret letter that no one else is able to examine. So this is complete lack of transparency, and the fact that this was able to go ahead without any challenge is just amazing.
Some faculty about violations of academic freedom and freedom of expression at MRU. Both these things are in fact very well protected at Mount Royal. What I find particularly troubling, however, is how these phantom threats to academic freedom here at MRU all too often have been used as justifications for inviting or defending speakers who hold toxic, discriminatory views of all kinds.
Toxic and discriminatory views of all kinds. Why are these toxic and discriminatory? There's an obligation to defend this position, which never happened.
Whether these be the homophobic and transphobic arguments of so-called radical gender-critical feminists.
The homophobic and transphobic arguments of so-called gender-critical feminists. Who is he referring to? He is referring to Megan Murphy here, who was invited by me to sit with Julie Ray Goldstein to discuss the question, does trans activism negatively impact women's rights? How are these views transphobic and especially homophobic, Dr. Murray?
White supremacism and xenophobia dressed up as cultural geography and immigration studies.
For people who don't know the backstory of that, that was Mark Hecht, who was a contract faculty member who was as well pushed out of Mount Royal University by a number of faculty members who wrote a secret letter denouncing him to the administration. We got that through Freedom of Information, but it was all redacted, so we don't know who is responsible for that.
Atheism and secular humanism as a cover for Islamophobia.
That's Armin Navabi, who was invited in March 2019 to give a talk on how Islam could not be reformed. And so that's seen as being Islamophobic, of course, when we all wanted to hear what he had to, well, not all of us, but Rational Space Network members wanted to hear what he had to say. We were prevented from hearing that because of the cancellation that happened at the behest of a number of faculty members who did not want that view to be expressed at Mount Royal University. That is a violation of our freedom of expression, academic freedom, because we as faculty members were not able to hear this other point of view.
Or the pervasive, ongoing, relentless anti-Indigenous views to which everyone in attendance here, with the possible exception of Mira, has been relentlessly subjected to over and over again in every academic venue imaginable.
So who do you think that is that he's talking about? Relentless anti-Indigenous views expressed over and over again in every academic context imaginable. Well, it is Francis Widdowson he's talking about, and the fact he's able to do this at a union event without me being given any ability to reply just is extremely upsetting to this day. And that is the power that some of these faculty members have within the union, that they're able to get a soapbox to denounce their colleagues, and there are no consequences for doing that.
In every one of these instances, the imperative protecting academic freedom of MRU has been used to legitimize and defend public expressions of views that, in my estimation, are hateful and discriminatory.
in his estimation, are hateful and discriminatory. That needs to be substantiated. That never has been substantiated. How are my views hateful and discriminatory? So that is the recording of that event. And that is amazing that happened. And that was 7 months before I was fired. That gives you a bit of an understanding of the kinds of things that were happening behind the scenes. So in 2022, this is after I was fired, I wanted to go to the retreat, which is held in May of every year. It's a great event. You get to hear all sorts of speakers. The union, of course, pushed me out of the union, so I would be able to give a talk. So what I did was I prepared a video and had my colleagues present it to others, and also posted this on the internet. And at 4 minutes and 8 seconds, that's when I provide a response to Murray. But anyway, this is the beginning of that. Hello, everyone. If you are viewing this video, it means that I have been prevented from giving this presentation in person because of the fact that the MRFA has been taken over by a particular faction, which is hostile to open inquiry and freedom of expression. So that was what happened, is that I was unable to give this talk in person because of all the controls that were happening with respect to the union. And as I mentioned, at 4 minutes and 8 seconds, this is where I get into being able to provide a response to what it is that Murray had said. This is something that I want to respectful, hateful comments, full, that's imaginable, defend public expression, those remarks. There are 4 speakers, which members of this panel actually supported their expression. So supported their ability to put forward those ideas at various events. The gender critical feminist referred to as Megan Murphy, who presented her views at the Does Trans Activism Negatively Impact Women's Rights event that the Rational Space Network put on. The reference to atheism, and Islamophobia is to Armin Navabi, who the Rational Space Network rebooked his event after it had been canceled and then postponed by MRU administration. The third view is to Mark Hecht, who is a former MRU faculty member, contract faculty member, who wrote an op-ed in the Vancouver Sun, arguing that too much ethnic diversity undermined trust, social trust. And then the final view is to me, with respect to my views. And I find this reference of particular concern because the ideas that my views are anti-Indigenous, toxic, hateful, and discriminatory form the basis of my termination from Mount Royal University. And the assertion that these 4 people, Murphy, Navabi, Hecht, and me, were espousing hateful and discriminatory views indicates how a faction within our union has become hostile to open inquiry and freedom of expression. So that is the serious problem when you have a faction takes over the union, because that means the union cannot fairly represent those people who are not part of the faction. This hostility of certain MRFA members to open inquiry raises 2 questions. The first is, what constitutes hateful and discriminatory views? And the second is, what do we do as professors when such views are expressed in the classroom? I will address the first question in the rest of my talk and then leave the other to the question and answer, which unfortunately I'm not able to attend because of the actions of this faction that has taken over the MRFA. Now, in terms of defining what is hateful or discriminatory, these can be found in Supreme Court decisions. With respect to hate speech, it's the 2013 Watcott decision, which is the most important. And in this decision, it's stated that it's not just discrediting, humiliating, or offending a victim that constitutes hate speech. It is a very high bar that must be met. And this is the bar of what's called detestation and vilification. And what detestation and vilification do is they essentially assert that that person or this particular group has no place in society. There's terms used such as rendering them lawless, so not really able to obtain the protection of the law. Those kinds of statements about groups. That's what hate speech is. And in terms of discrimination, we've seen this definition recently in the Ward decision, which actually came down in 2021. And in this decision, the Supreme Court states that discrimination is not just differential treatment. It is about forms of differential treatment according to on a protected ground in human rights legislation that impairs that person from having full and equal exercise of rights and freedoms to which they're entitled. So it actually has an impact, a significant impact on that person's ability to be able to enjoy rights and freedoms in society. So that gives you a sense of what an actual academic argument looks like. So instead of just throwing out terms like hateful and discriminatory, you go and look at the actual definitions and you substantiate what it is that you're talking about, which is not what happened in May 2021 and happened throughout my career at Mount Royal University. People just throwing out these very serious allegations without, sort of providing the academic basis on which to make them. And that is a travesty. So that's what happened in terms of the discussions that Murray was having and my reaction to them. In terms of the September 20th, 2024 meeting, another person who was unable to attend, in addition to myself, is Kelly Sundberg, Senior Grievance Officer. And this was because, in part, Sundberg had said that I'd been ganged up on by a number of faculty members. And therefore, Elena Razankowska, who was a board member at the time, complained about Sundberg. And Sundberg was prevented from coming to this meeting. So this seems to be a real concern of this faction. They don't want it to be said that I was ganged up on, which is, at the look of the evidence, it is definitely the case. So, methinks the lady doth protest too much in this situation. And then again, Dr. Sundberg allegedly reaffirmed his previous testimony, stating that certain faculty members had ganged up on Dr. Widdowson. So that attempts of Dr. Sundberg to defend me were seen as being a serious problem by this faction. And so as a result of the meeting on September 20th, 2024, on 5 days later, on September 25th, the executive board sent out an incredible email to all members. And in this email, this letter, it was kind of apologizing, saying that their attempts to defend me had caused harm to this gang of 17 and all the other professors who are part of this woke faction. And this is what this email says here. I'll see if I can, get it up here. The legal team, putting forth this argument about Francis Widdowson's case. This went out to all members. This is a letter that went out to all members. The gang of 17, referred to the faculty as a gang of 17. After careful review of submissions and notes taken, we are relieved to note that our legal counsel never used the gang of 17, despite this footnoted thing in the arbitration decision. Second, they believe they've let down some members their recognition that the arbitration process has been difficult for a number of members, and acknowledge that some of those members that has the union ever expressed that sentiment to me, that I had to go through 30 hearing days throughout the entire year of 2023, all the problems that I had to experience in terms of all of this? This is just a shocking email sent out to all members of the union. It just is amazing. And then, because of the submissions, which I had posted, I didn't realize that they were not supposed to be posted, because I thought, why wouldn't the union want it to be known what had happened to me? What happened is that, some members of this woke faction saw these materials, and lo and behold, the legal team had used the term Gang of 17 in response, because it had been, and it wasn't anything wrong with it. This had been coined by Michael Ford, and he put this into popular usage. So the legal team is just repeating what it is that Michael Ford said. But this has caused great upset in the union amongst this woke faction, and talking about how these members are hurt and angry that they had been referred to in the report as the Gang of 17, which is an inflammatory and derogatory term, in addition to being inaccurate. So this is the president of the union saying this was inaccurate to say that I was ganged up on, which it is completely accurate. I was mobbed. I was subject to this abuse by an academic mobbing, which was allowed by Mount Royal University to take place. And I am still being punished for this situation, but I'm not going to be silent about this. I have a right to defend myself and clear my name, and I am tired of being silenced by all these people who are saying that if I, try to defend myself, then this is further evidence that I shouldn't be reinstated. And then now the CAT, they've confirmed their use of the term in the written submissions. It was without malicious intent. Then this Brenda Lang, the president, can meet with members who have been impacted by the arbitration process. Has she ever met with me to discuss the terrible impacts of the arbitration on me? Not. Let's just say no. It's all been procedural kind of stuff, as if, I would think she'd be defending me anyway. There's an investigation report that you can take a look at, all the interactions that existed. I have all the complaints that were made that show all of them kind of interacting on social media. And in addition, there is an entity called the MRU Anti-Racism Coalition, which has 63 members. And, I'm sure there's a large overlap between that and the Gang of 17, although they're secret. It's a secret membership list, so I won't be able to prove that. Anyway, Murray and Mulholland were not complained about. They were not part of the Gang of 17, what's called the Gang of 17, but they were involved in the amplification of various denunciations of me. In this case, right, the Students Association, they were condemning my social media comments, satirizing the comparison of the Holocaust to the residential school. And then we have a whole bunch of repostings that Mary Mulholland made. And of course, the MRU Anti-Racism Coalition figures very high. This is where I'm called a racist prof by the MRU Anti-Racism Coalition. This kind of thing, school denialism. This is part of the mobbing that went on. All sorts of accusations about me, how I dehumanize people, and so on. This is what Mary Lee Mulholland was retweeting, amplifying. So that is what happened with respect to a number of faculty members and their response to me, how they interacted with the union, how the union is completely supportive of this faction to the detriment of my interests, something that is not supposed to happen, right? And so what we see is, very powerful faculty members have a lot of influence in the union, and this has serious consequences for trans activism, because trans activism is a major part of what people are upset about in terms of one's ability to criticize this. And this is going to make faculty members very afraid to talk about this particular area, because you know that your union is not going to defend you because they are behind the trans activists. So that is the sequence of events that happened with respect to the union. As I mentioned, the arbitrator, David Philip Jones, said that I can't be reinstated because of the reluctance of members to see me back at Mount Royal University, some colleagues, and also the friction. We've seen a number of colleagues who don't want to see me back, most significantly being Scott Murray and Mary Lee Mulholland, who were able to make this case to the entire membership without me being allowed to attend and defend myself. How on earth can that happen within a union? And that is an outrage, and I will be holding the union to account at the end of all this process for doing that. So that's the reluctance. In terms of the friction, it is the ideas that I was trying to discuss, which were very upsetting. Claim that there are only two sexes, because this feeds into the whole trans activism kind of file. But as we saw from Dr. Murray's comments in May 2021, there's a number of other ideas concerning Islam and whether diversity harms social trust, and also the indigenization area. But for the purposes of this video, what we're concerned about is the area of trans activism and the ideas that we need to talk about to be able to understand what is going on with respect to this policy area. And in 2019, I had a discussion with Megan Murphy, I remember it very clearly, about how trans was a mental illness, because you can't be born in the wrong body. Your body is your body. And if you can't accept your body, there's something mentally, something going amiss mentally that needs to be addressed. And this is not to stigmatize people. Everyone realizes now that people have mental health challenges. It's a very difficult world to live in today, with all sorts of uncertainties, and we don't really have very much guidance on how to live in the world. But the solution to a mental illness is not pretending that it's not a mental illness and it's some kind of biological situation, which has happened in the case of trans activism. And because I was very afraid at that time in 2019, I didn't speak out about how this was a mental illness. And I know I'm only one person, I can only do so much. But again, it was the intimidation, the terrible environment that exists in universities that prevents these discussions from taking place. And right now, I'm going to be going to Montreal in a few days to participate in the COSBAR event, which is about restoring reality to the discussion of trans issues. And I really want to talk about universities and what's happened in universities, because universities are the one place where people used to be protected when they were discussing controversial ideas like trans activism. And as we see from my case, that was completely destroyed. And so discussing whether or not men who believe they're women are women, whether trans rights are human rights, whether there are only two sexes, all those very important topics were not allowed to be expressed, or you could express them, but there would be serious consequences because you would be ostracized and pushed out of the universities. So what we need to do is realize the terrible problems that exist in universities, because it's very, very important for universities to be able to be intellectual spaces and not to be talking about emotional safety and harm. And as I mentioned in many times in the arbitration case, which was held against me, Mount Royal University says, I can't be reinstated because of this. I said, I will fight to the end to make sure that universities become academic spaces once more. Thank you very much.